College football nerds talking Florida Gators. We are back. We put some content out last week, doing some this week, which means we are consistent with our off-season content for once. And this time we're talking Florida. Like I said, I've got Josh with me as usual. We're going to dive right into it. Want to remind y'all, if you haven't, especially Florida Gator fans who maybe haven't been super high on us in the past, because we haven't been super high on your team, and we'll own it. Like and subscribe. You're going to like what you hear. Stick with us throughout the season. I think you'll love it. Josh, I have been a defender of Florida to the non-SEC fans of the world. I think it's funny. I want to go back to 2018, where especially our Big Ten fans complained about Florida and Kentucky being overrated, SEC bias. Y'all, you got Florida ranked in the top 10. You got Kentucky ranked in the top 10. They go to the bowl season and they beat, in Florida's instance, beat the crap out of super highly ranked Big Ten counterparts, and then we heard nothing. We hear nothing about it afterwards, and then come into 2019, Florida, oh, you got Florida ranked in the top 10. I can't believe it. They looked ugly here. They're overrated, SEC bias, blah, blah, blah. Boom, 11-win season, beat a good Virginia team in the bowl game. Really only, losing to LSU and Georgia, there's no shame in that. And both of those games were pretty close. I feel like we in the SEC maybe appreciate more. You and I, Josh, maybe not enough. We appreciate Florida more than people do outside the SEC. And you were looking at some offensive numbers from Florida that maybe indicated that we didn't even give them the love that they were due. So why don't you run through some of those high-level offensive numbers first, and we'll get into what we think that means for Florida this year and maybe what we're missing, and maybe we can touch on that a little bit as we go.
Florida last year, I think, kind of got a bad rap because they had that really early game with Miami. They didn't play particularly well in that game. We talked about it a lot at the time, that Florida was clearly, in our view, the better team and just managed not to let themselves win by a significant margin. But I think a lot of people nationally didn't see what happened with Kyle Trask came in as a quarterback and what happened statistically. So in the SEC, the two top teams in the SEC offensively were LSU and Alabama. They actually tied in yards per play overall at 7.89 yards per play. Almost 8 yards per play on average in the season is insane. That shouldn't surprise anybody watching LSU and Alabama. What I think they did, though, is kind of overshadowed the fact that Florida was actually third, and they were third by a margin. Florida was 6.47 yards per play. Fourth and fifth were Mississippi State and Kentucky, oddly enough, 6.16 and 6.15. Georgia down there at 6.08. So Florida was like a half yard per play better than Georgia through the season. They were maybe a little less than that better than Mississippi State and Kentucky. Nationally, maybe not at quite as highly ranked, but still like 16th in the country in yards per game passing. Okay, so a lot of people still have the idea that Florida was a not great offensive team, but it just in terms of pure yardage, they averaged over 300 yards per game. And again, offensively, and I'll even say defensively, third in the SEC in scoring offense, third in the SEC in passing yards per game, second in the SEC in scoring defense, second in rushing defense, second in total defense. Florida was a statistically very good team last season. They simply had a bad game to open the year against Miami, which is all a lot of people saw. They lost a shootout against LSU, which I don't think they get enough credit for that even still. And they lost a close game to a Georgia team that was actually quite good, despite everybody wanting to downplay them. Florida was a good team, and they were especially a good offensive team last year.
To me, and you can tell me if this is a little off base, but to me, so far, last couple of years, they've felt like, if we're going to compare them to a team in another conference, they've felt a lot like Penn State to me. And I would have loved, bowl tie-ins and all. We didn't get that Florida-Penn State game that we should have gotten in the bowl game last year. We got Virginia and Memphis should have played one another. Florida and Penn State should have played one another. That's another story for another day. To me, they feel like Penn State in that they're a good team. They're a 10-11 win team, but they can't quite get to the level they need to be to consistently win, handle the teams that they need to handle, and be a real threat on a national level. I'm going to go ahead and give it away because I want to talk about it as we go. For me right now, this is the season that changes that a little bit. And Florida fans, I know you're probably falling out of your chair right now because I'm being positive about your team. If I had to pick today, and I kind of am because we're doing previews, I would pick Florida to win the SEC East and be a legit contender to make the playoffs. Let's go ahead and get into that. Am I crazy for thinking that? Do you think that as well? And if we're saying this now, we can't also say it for Georgia, so we kind of got to put our neck out and make that prediction.
I certainly don't think it's crazy. A lot of polls have them top 10. Some polls do have them preseason number 1 in the SEC East. Look, we know less about these teams than we normally do, especially teams like Georgia that have recruited at a high level and have a lot of turnover. We really don't know what teams look like this year. But at the end of the day, I think it's fair to say that Florida at least is pulled even with Georgia. And it's clear those two teams are kind of the class of the SEC East. Florida has a favorable schedule. They play LSU as they always do, but out of the West, you draw Ole Miss. It's not a bad thing. You're going to be in a position, if you're Florida, to be able to make something happen this year, to be able to make noise on the national stage. You're not playing Auburn, which was a tough game to play, especially a week before you play LSU. So I think personally the biggest thing with Florida is it's a combination of a team that's improving in terms of talent, and it's a team that has a lot of the key pieces back. You mentioned Penn State. I know some Big Ten fans going to watch this and be a little bit offended, but if you look at Florida's depth chart with like Grimes and Tony and Copeland, running back maybe a little less settled, but with Trask and the skill players, it's a lot more talented, I think, than team, in my opinion, probably than Penn State, especially with Hamler gone there. But they don't get viewed the same way. At least, I think, weirdly in fan reputation. Again, national pundits, I think Athlon had them like 6th in the country. They are respected, but I just don't get the vibe that people respect them the way they should for how they are. So I do agree with you, and I think it's a little early for me to quite say that I would necessarily pick them to be the East winner. Maybe you can persuade me that by the end of the video. But I do think at the very least they're in the conversation, and they should be in the conversation nationally as one of the very nationally relevant teams. I think even though they're an 11-win team, much more than they have been in recent years.
The reason I think they win the East, one is schedule. It sets up pretty well. Like you said, it's good that they don't have Auburn right before LSU. They have South Carolina, who I think is going to be better this year. But then they've got Ole Miss, which to me, like, I'm not as down on Ole Miss as everybody was nationally last year, but I would much rather play Ole Miss after LSU than Auburn. So I think that's pretty comfortable. I don't love their out-of-conference schedule, if I'm being honest. Like, yes, they have Florida State every year, and they can't help that Florida State sucks. You and I both think Florida State's going to be better this year, but not good enough to really move the needle. And then I've got Eastern Washington, South Alabama, and New Mexico State. I don't love that, but to Florida's credit, and they have this in future schedules and have had this in past schedules, they do a lot of playing 2 Power 5 teams out of conference when they don't have to. And Clemson does this. Clemson deserves credit as well. When you play an SEC schedule and then you have a tie-in with a Florida State who has historically been, in the last 20, 30 years, historically been very good, and then you're going out and scheduling another Power 5 team, like, Florida deserves credit for that. Everybody likes to pick on the one FCS directional school, whatever, that they play, and ignore the fact that their schedule is still very hard. Last year, their schedule was good. So I think it sets up favorably for them to be undefeated rolling into LSU. But then we talked about this last year. At scale, it's tough. You look at one game individually, like Tennessee, South Carolina. Maybe those aren't that bad, but you got Tennessee, South Carolina, LSU, Ole Miss, then Georgia. That's a little bit of a challenge. I'm sure there's a bye week in there too, but that can set up to be a little bit challenging. But tell me this. You've been historically, the last few years, down on the talent there in Florida, specifically in the linebacker position. Why don't you talk about that a little bit? And it's a nuanced thing. We're just picking out one position in a quick preview. But I think it exemplifies kind of the maturation and the progress that Florida's made. So why don't you get into that a little bit?
Especially a couple years ago when the defense took a dip. My theory on what's going on has been talent related. I don't think it should explain, or I don't think it should surprise anyone that the Jim McElwain era did not produce exceptionally talented units at Florida. And the thing that I noted a lot, as it was a couple years ago, I think it was like Van Jefferson, maybe it was Moon and Reese. I'm trying to remember who the full starting unit was at the time. Forgive me, it's probably wrong. But that unit didn't have top 100 guys in it. They were like, number 300 overall recruit, number 350 overall recruit. If you look at the recruiting rankings of the linebackers they've had in the past few years, they have not been on the level of what you expect at Florida. That's not to say that they're not good players, but as an example, David Reese is the leading tackler last year. And we talked about a little early and even into midseason, if David Reese is your leading tackler, that probably isn't really a great thing. And Reese was a good player. He knew his job. He played his position very well. He was consistently where he needed to be. He was not an elite talent. There's a reason he was undrafted. I'm not digging the guy. I think sometimes people have a hard time understanding this. I have more respect for players that are maybe an undrafted player that plays at a very high level, because it says a lot about them and what they do and how they run, their day-to-day life and how they train and prepare for games. But Florida hasn't had a spikes. I mean, they haven't had enforcers defensively on the second level like they used to. They've had some really good secondary players. Now, they've been a little spotty. They've had good secondary players. They've had injury issues, and they've also had weaknesses in the secondary, and never quite all having all those pieces at the same time. And they've had some good linemen, but I think the biggest thing to me defensively with Florida has been the linebacker play. It's been guys like Reese, who goes undrafted, even though he's easily the leading tackler on the team last year. You need guys that are elite level athletes to succeed if you're Florida. And I think the thing that's turning a little bit, if you are Florida, is you see things like Jeremiah Moon, who's a really good player, may or may not start. Brenton Cox is coming over as a transfer. You guys like Zachary Carter coming on. The linebacker position is getting a little bit more talented. Things are turning around a little bit more. It's going to take Mullen a few years. We still got to see how he's doing in recruiting. But there was definitely a low point, and I think as the talent improves, it's going to change the way that team is able to execute, and it's really where it's going to impact Florida. And you talked about not being able to, necessarily handle their business, but like last year they go 11-2, beat the teams they should beat, but they still won some of those sloppy, like Kentucky and Miami. They need to be at a level where you can pummel a good number of those teams. You're going to have a couple close ones, but most you should win by a margin in order to be able to be at the level where you can realistically beat an LSU or a Georgia at a decent clip.
Okay, so you said I need to persuade you. I'm going to make my case, and then you tell me what you think, and then you can digest that, and then tell me what you think for Florida's season in your prediction at a high level. For me, Florida winning the East this year, my prediction for Florida winning the East this year has as much to do with Georgia as it does to do with Florida. I don't love, with all the COVID stuff going on, Georgia breaking in, new OCs, new quarterbacks. I don't love that, because I want to see them in spring. I want to see them in a full fall camp, not people sitting out because they've, tested positive and all that. I think it's going to be weird and clunky for them. Not to mention that their crosser goes from Texas A&M to Alabama. And to me, that's huge. Florida's trading Auburn for Ole Miss. Georgia's trading A&M for Alabama. Last year, Notre Dame, that 23-17 win for Georgia, was in week 4. They had 3 tune-ups, and then they played Notre Dame. It was an ugly game. Then they had Tennessee, South Carolina, Kentucky, and then they had Florida, and that was another close game. And then they had Missouri, then Auburn, another close game, Texas A&M. These are all close games, and then they get stomped by LSU. So I think last year was as much timing as anything for Georgia. This year they open with UVA, who's not terrible. That's going to be a physical team that's pretty well coached. That's going to make them have to prepare, which means they can't prepare all summer for week 3, which is Alabama. And to me, I feel like Georgia is now likely, on paper at least, taking an assumed loss in Alabama, which is an SEC loss. And we don't get into tiebreakers for head-to-head and stuff like that in the division until we get past the SEC record. So I think Florida comes into this season one game up on Georgia because of Ole Miss as their crosser versus Alabama as their crosser. So all of that, and then we have to expect that Newman is the guy that we think his potential is and not the guy his numbers have proven to be, even against poor competition. That's my argument. I'm picking Florida to win the East this year. Did I persuade you? And tell me what you think they're going to do in the East this year.
Still tough. I think you did make a compelling point. And let me be really clear. If I had to make a call, I think I'd pick Florida based off what you just said. I still think you're flipping a coin. And if you were to put a number on it, maybe it's 51-49. I think you're flipping a coin. And the part of the problem is that Georgia is such an unknown. The thing that gives me more confidence in Florida is the fact that the offense does return a lot of pieces, and I have a lot more confidence in Florida's ability to score points. I think offensive line continuity is going to be a lot more important this year than it has been in recent years. Everybody knows offensive line starters matter. Those secondary starters, I'll say as an aside, is actually a better indicator of success, but offensive line starters do matter. I think it's going to matter a lot more. Teams that haven't been able to do more scrimmages and practices are going to have some serious growing pains during the season. And Georgia's kind of starting over at a lot of different positions. Combine that with, basically an entire roster that's being overhauled. I'm not as sold on Newman. We may do a preview and we can talk about that, but I think their quarterback situation's unsettled. There are a lot more question marks with Georgia. Now, I think Georgia's defense will be better than Florida's, and Georgia's defense might be one of the better units in the country, but Georgia was an offense that couldn't score many points last year. They could be worse this year. I know they get Monken instead of Chaney. I don't know. We'll save that for the Georgia video. I have more confidence in Florida as an established team with the pieces they have returning. Georgia is more of a wild card, and I think at the end of the day, I have more confidence because I think Florida is going to be able to score a lot based off what we talked about at the beginning of the video. They're one of the better offenses in the SEC, and we talk a lot that having a good offense can usually keep you from having a slip up in the modern RPO world. And so because of that, I think I would, and as you said, Florida kind of gets a leg up with the schedule. I do think they have a leg up on Georgia. I think it's even if Georgia wins the game against Florida, like you said, if they do take a loss early against Alabama, they still can end up losing the East if they lose another game. And given all the turnover they have offensively and the offensive woes they had in a lot of games last year, I think maybe that's fairly likely. I definitely think Florida-Georgia for the East is probably one of the tighter picks, though, on the national landscape. But this is absolutely, in my mind, the year that Florida deserves to be picked even with Georgia going into the season, where normally we talk about how Florida is going to surprise you by being a good team. This year we're saying Florida has a real chance to be a legitimate team in the playoff hunt late in the year, not just some fluke or not a team that could be a dark horse.
Okay, so maybe we'll frame it like this, and you tell me if you agree with this, and then we'll wrap it up. Florida, based on everything we know, would be our pick to win the East. When you incorporate the unknowns and look at the whole picture, Georgia is the only one between the two that, if the unknowns pay off, could win a national championship.
I would generally agree with that.
Yeah. I do want to point out one more thing, and we'll talk about this in our LSU preview. LSU fans aren't going to love us for this. We're not nearly as high on LSU as LSU fans are this year. We think they take a considerable step back. So that's another positive for Florida, and they get them at home. Florida's going to be favored in that game. Georgia may not even be favored against Auburn. So that's another thing to consider. All right, y'all, that is our quicker. We're trying to do these faster and not talk so much. I think YouTube is actually, algorithm's actually hurting us for that as well. That's our quicker review or preview for Florida this season. Let us know in the comments what you think Florida's going to do this season. Are we crazy for thinking they should be considered right now the front runner for the East? Let us know. Get at us. Thanks so much, y'all, for hanging on with us this early in the season. Y'all have a great week, and God bless.